Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be back at Leeds Song again this year and to see across the lights some familiar faces in the audience. I'm Katy Hamilton, if we've not yet had a chance to meet, hello, and welcome to this pre-concert talk for a particularly intriguing concert this evening, the 7 Deadly Sins Cabaret. There's a positive variety pack of Vice coming your way at 7:30, courtesy of Axel, Fleur and Julius. And we've got lots of very varied and very wonderful repertoire to get through, but I thought we'd start by taking a moment to get into the whole business of what cabaret actually is. I'm sorry that I'm not more appropriately dressed as either the MC or Liza Minnelli, but frankly, either option would be equally uncomfortable for me and horrifying for you. So, the cabaret, of course, is French by origin. The word comes from an earlier term in French meaning a tavern. And for a long time, the idea of a cabaret was associated with illegal activities of all kinds. So these were places where criminals would gather. You wouldn't want to be anywhere near a cabaret because they would be the bars full of lowlifes, dodgy deals, and so on. And it's really only in the late 18th century that several cabarets become associated with gatherings of men of letters to talk about literature, to enjoy food and wine, and probably a bit of debauchery and crime as well, because they are men of letters after all. But the opportunity to meet in a sociable space that involved conversation and food and entertainment of some kind, at that point probably a street musician of some kind who might come in and make music, perhaps would have topical songs of the moment, politically speaking, or would make songs up about the regulars in the actual cabaret itself. But it's the sociability, the space, the chance to talk and eat and drink as a combination that is important. And let's not forget that in the early 19th century, so in the kind of 30 to 50 year period after the cabaret first becomes a place for some sorts of discussion, as a result of the French Revolution, there were crackdowns in government across a lot of Western Europe by parties that were terrified of a repeat of the French Revolution in their own countries, that meant that there was a positive clampdown against the idea of sociable communal meeting. Think of Schubert's Biedermeier Vienna. It's cozy and you all stay at home, but it's cozy and you all stay at home because there is a deliberate political policy in place to keep citizens as politically naive as possible and encourage them to socialize in the domestic space, not go out and gather in communities, in clubs, where they might be seditious, where they might cause trouble, where the secret police needs to watch them. And you may know that Schubert was himself a member of a society, a nonsense club, quite literally a nonsense club, that was raided by the police, and one of his friends was arrested and exiled as a result of that. So this kind of sociability really couldn't be taken for granted in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. The really important moment for the cabaret and for the programme we're going to hear this evening comes in 1881 with the foundation of Le Chat Noir, the Black Cat, in Paris. And that is where the modern idea of cabaret as a place of entertainment, experimentation, and crucially, freedom of thought and expression comes into being. Because cabarets are sociable, they're artistically daring, they're sexy, they're current. And there is an edge to the cabaret, particularly when it migrates to Germany in the early 20th century. If you think of the most famous cabaret songs that stay with us, like Kurt Weill's Mackie Messer, Mac the Knife, it's a great song and it's a catchy tune and it's a fabulous cabaret number and it's about a mass murderer. But we all know the tune, which is the really important bit. I should also mention that Claude Debussy, we're going to hear from him this evening, he was a keen visitor to Le Chat Noir, which moved location within a few years of being founded. There was a Swiss guard on the door who refused entry to priests and soldiers. The waiters, intriguingly, I found this line in a book and I've not been able to get to the bottom of what they mean. The waiters were dressed as academics. See me afterwards if you know what that's about. And one of the house pianists was Eric Satie. Now, the French cabaret benefited, as did the German cabaret a few decades later, also from a particular moment of foundation when there were certain legal and technological advances that permitted certain things to happen in the space. So, for example, they were gaslit, which put a certain kind of atmosphere into play. There were performance rights for singer-songwriters had very recently been revised in Paris, which meant it was increasingly possible to make a living through writing the sort of music that might be performed in a cabaret space, popular song, and so on. And there was also, very importantly, the fact that the cabaret distinguished itself from the café-concert that were very popular at the time, which would have audiences of potentially hundreds of people. But there was a license in place for the café-concert that forbade costumes, sets, pantomime, dancing, and the mixture of song and recitation in a given event. The cabaret was new enough as a format in the way that it was set up at Le Chat Noir that it could ignore all of those restrictions. And that meant that it became a space for a kind of multimedia experience. So cabaret artists could speak, they could sing. There were, within a few years, shadow plays being put on at Le Chat Noir, and all kinds of experiments that could go on in a sort of very French, very kind of subversive version of the Gesamtkunstwerk, basically, that you could really play with the different kind of media that you brought into a given performance and not have to worry about the regulations, which you did if you were in a theatre or you were running a café-concert. One composer we hear from numerous times this evening is Kurt Weill, including a song that he wrote for the Parisian cabaret scene, that is Je ne t'aime pas, which was written specifically for Lise Gauthier, a French cabaret singer, after Weill had left Germany and spent some time in Paris before he ultimately emigrated to the United States. And so with Weill, we're hearing from a composer who really understood what it was to write for the cabaret in its heyday in Berlin, and also spent time in Paris, but took that knowledge with him into, and that approach, into his other works, his stage works of various kinds. So we're going to hear that kind of bittersweet cabaret brutality, effectively, in Surabaya Johnny, from his 1929 show Happy End, from the song cycle turned opera The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni, and, of course, in the remarkable ballet chanté, sung ballet, Seven Deadly Sins of 1933, which gives this evening its title. That is an extraordinary piece if you've not had a chance to see it. We have Anna 1, who is a singer, and Anna 2, who is a dancer. They're sisters, and they travel through 7 cities in 7 years, and in each city we encounter a sin. And there is a kind of conversation between the two, because Anna 1 is the good, sensible party who can sing the morals of the story to us. Anna 2 is a dancer. She's all about her body, and she is prone to bad behaviour. Quite who has won the day by the time we get to the end and they return home older and wiser through their experiences is somewhat moot. You'll have to see the show to find out what happens. But rather interestingly, when it was first performed in this country in the same year, in 1933, it was premiered at the Champs-Élysées in Paris. It then came here, and it was renamed Anna, with a hyphen in between, because the Lord Chamberlain's office thought that the original title might offend religious susceptibilities. What's particularly brilliant, though, is that the libretto was not changed at all, because Lotte Lenya sang the first performance, and only the first performance, in German. And so not a jot of the libretto was changed. The plot remains exactly the same, only the title was shifted. Another turn-of-the-century cabaret composer we hear from tonight is, perhaps surprisingly, Arnold Schoenberg. Now, Schoenberg moved to Berlin in 1901, where he was given a job at the Überbrettel, a cabaret that had just been founded at the end of that year by Ernst von Wolzogen, who ran a variety theatre called the Bundestheater, originally on the Alexanderplatz, right in the centre of Berlin, which opened in November 1901. And Wolzogen's cabaret was, of course, modelled on Le Chat Noir. It was modelled on the French cabaret ideal. Early musicians involved in the Überbrettel include not only Schoenberg, but also Victor Holländer, whose son Friedrich Holländer provided the music for The Blue Angel with Marlene Dietrich in 1930, and the operetta composer Oskar Strauss. So he had some quite prominent musicians involved, in some cases really quite early in their career. And the name Überbrettel had been coined a few years earlier in 1897. That's the year Brahms dies, just to put this in context with the ideas of modernity knocking around at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. So in 1897, a novel was written by Otto Julius Bierbaum, who coined the term Überbrettel as being above and beyond Über, the local theatres or show, the Brettel, the boards, literally, the boards. And German cabaret became particularly noted for its gallows humour, of which Kurt Weill is a perfect example, and its strong association with the political left and ultimately opposition to the Nazi Party. By 1906, so within 5 years of the Überbrettel opening, there were 33 cabarets in Berlin. So it became incredibly popular very, very quickly. And we hear one of Schoenberg's songs specifically written for the Überbrettel, Aus dem Spiegel von Arkadien. It's one of 8 Brettellieder that he composed not long after he got the job from Wolfsoggen. And the text was taken from a collection of poetry written by Wolfsoggen and Bierbaum and various other colleagues, including Frank Wedekind, who is the playwright who wrote both Spring Awakening and the 2 plays which eventually formed the basis of Berg's opera libretto for Lulu. And the song that we hear this evening, rather than being by any of those, is actually to a text by Emanuel Schikaneder, which is to say, the librettist of the Magic Flute and the original Papageno. But what is really interesting about this is that although Schikaneder is a man writing this it's quite a Papageno-ish text, there's a drum sound, a boom, boom, boom line, very much in the Papageno model in the 1790s. The fact that it is being set to music by Schoenberg in 1901, 1902 rather draws out the sleaziness of what Schikaneder is trying to say. I'll leave it there. You can enjoy the text when you get to the song later. And having already mentioned Schoenberg, we should get onto the group of musicians that we'll hear from this evening, Schoenberg being one, who were personally acquainted, and in some cases biblically acquainted. Imagine, if you will, the following group sitting politely at round tables with their cocktails in their hands preparing for the performance. So we start with Gustav Mahler, whom we hear from tonight. In 1902, the year after Wolfsoggen founded the Überbrettel, Gustav Mahler married a young, brilliant composer called Alma Schindler, who you'll also be hearing from this evening. Alma Schindler was herself a composer, but was made to stop music by Gustav when they married. That was a condition of the marriage. There was only room for one composer, and it was him. Before she'd settled on Gustav, Alma had been having really quite a torrid affair with her music teacher, her composition teacher, Alexander von Zemlinsky. We're hearing a song by him as well. And at more or less the same time that this was all going on, and Alma had met Mahler and was trying to decide what to do and whether to stay with Alex and whether to go with Gustav and so on, Schoenberg married Zemlinsky's sister Matilda. Alma Schindler then, of course, did marry Mahler. A few years into their marriage, she cheated on him with the architect Walter Gropius, and Mahler found out and said to his wife, "Do you want to leave?" And she said no. And he was so relieved that he dug out all the scores of her earlier compositions that he'd forced her to give up. And she came back from a walk one day and found him sitting on the floor surrounded by her manuscript saying, "What have I done? You have to keep composing. Obviously, you have to keep composing." And consequently encouraged her to begin again and encouraged her also to publish some of the material that she had let sit in a drawer in the years of their marriage, which is how the song you're going to hear this evening, Laue Sommernacht, became one of the first groups of songs, individual numbers within a group of songs, that she finally actually published as a result of being unfaithful. I'm not quite sure what the moral of that story is, but Alma eventually married Walter Gropius in 1915, 4 years after Gustav died, and they had a daughter called Manon, who was adored. She was very beautiful and a very kind of beautiful spirit. And she was adored by many artists and musicians who were familiar with the family, in particular Alban and Helene Berg. And when Manon died at the age of 18 of polio, Berg dedicated his violin concerto to her memory. We're going to hear a song by Berg as well. And then there's finally the fact that Kurt Weill wrote a show with Alma's third husband, Franz Werfel, when they found themselves effectively exiled to America as a result of the rise of the Nazi Party. They began working on a plot together whilst they were all in Germany, and when they found their way to the States, it was translated into English and it was put on stage as The Eternal Road. They didn't get on brilliantly well, and they didn't stay in touch. But we then have, of course, many of these musicians ending up in the USA, including Schoenberg, who rather more successfully moves to LA and becomes George Gershwin's regular tennis partner. And we'll hear from Gershwin too. Okay, enough degrees of separation here. We should also turn our attention to this business of what cabaret songs might actually be about, even if the songs that we hear this evening were not necessarily written in all cases to be included in a cabaret. And interestingly, there's a sort of clutch of subjects which pretty much account for most of the songs that you're going to hear this evening. Those are all subjects that you would expect to find in Le Chat Noir or a cabaret setting in the 1880s and 90s, namely alcohol, sex, not love, importantly, definitely sex. Love is in much shorter supply. Noisemakers, various, I'll explain. And what you can get away with if you're not from Western Europe with all its cold weather and good manners. Okay. So we'll take them in turn, which means starting with alcohol. That leaves us with Johannes Brahms' Unüberwindlich, which is all about a man obsessed with a lost love as he is obsessed with the bottle. And the title means insurmountable. The things that he can't get over are the treacherous woman who's left him and his craving for drink. And our other booze-soaked song that we're going to hear is a Kurt Weill number. It is the Alabama song from the Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagony, which is a very catchy chorus about the route to the next whiskey bar, because you can't get a party started until you've got your whiskey, and Mahagony is famously a city founded by criminals, where anything goes, and that's the glory of it and its ultimate downfall. So that deals with alcohol. Sex, well, that's sort of most of the songs on the roster, it has to be said. But we might hear mentioned the very first number you're going to hear, William Balcomb's Amor, where a woman sends the whole town doolally because she just looks so good, all they can do is fall at her feet. There's Sibelius's sorry tale of a girl whose hands and lips turn red from the touch and kisses of her ultimately faithless lover. And there's Stephen Sondheim's The Girls of Summer, which is a slinky little number written for a play in 1956 by Richard Nash. Variety magazine rather brilliantly described The Girls of Summer, that was the name of the actual show as well as this particular song, as a comedy drama about a seemingly healthy 30-ish spinster who is secretly afraid of life. And as any Freudian knows, life is synonymous with sex. So we have this wonderful song about these languorous girls who get burned. It's summer. And yet the woman who is singing it, who is the well-behaved 30-ish spinster, which is a remarkable way of putting it, but it was 1956, is a safe party. But sometimes, of course, getting burned is not such a bad thing. Cole Porter's Night and Day is sung by a famous dancer who's fallen hopelessly in love with a young woman called Mimi and sings the song whilst they're dancing together. As a seduction song, it's a kind of romantic hypnosis as Fred Astaire is dancing. And Debussy's Célestas Langoureuse is about as direct a musical analogue as you can get to the lazing of post-coital lovers, as I know. Also, I'm afraid I simply can't go into the lyrics of William Balcomb's Over the Piano before you hear it. It's really not near enough the watershed yet, but it's an absolutely superb song. And in fact, in terms of the musical language, not unlike Schoenberg, but to rather different effect. Noisemakers might seem like a slightly odd category. The other way of putting this one, and I don't think any of the musicians are here, so I'm probably safe, is all animals, including musicians. So there's the cuckoo and the nightingale in Mahler's Lob des hohen Verstand, who want to have a competition, who is the best singer. This is never going to go well, and of course, they very foolishly, or rather the cuckoo, appeals to the donkey to be the judge of the singing competition with predictably hopeless results. Sticking with the ornithological, there's Ravel's wonderful Le Paon, the peacock, a majestic strutting bird, all elegance, beauty incarnate, fabulous colours from the piano. Everything's going brilliantly until he opens his beak. We've all been on dates like that. And then there's Poulenc's Violon, which has all the slink and slide of a cafe musician. We hear the violin very, very clearly in the piano writing and also in the vocal writing, as our musician of the moment. And finally, we hear from Schoenberg a song called Warnung, which is a very extraordinary song about jealousy, but the medium of jealousy here is the snarling and growling of the speaker's dog, whom he has poisoned for daring to growl at the woman he loves or is obsessed with. It's not entirely clear the nature of this relationship. But the dog haunts the song. Listen to the piano. You'll hear him growling and slobbering away all the way through. That brings us to a group of pieces which are all about sensuous appeal, which is to say the implicitly looser morals of characters and scenarios which don't take place in temperate, buttoned-up towns in Britain, Germany, or France, or actually even in Spain. Exhibit A in this category is Maurice Ravel's L'Indifférent from his 1903 song cycle Scheherazade, which was originally a plan for an opera. He'd started working on it as early as 1899, and he wrote an overture which was premiered that year and left the audience and critics kind of clutching their pearls. Ravel's music at this point was actually considered to be dangerous, morally dangerous, because of musically what he was trying to do. So he abandoned the idea of writing an opera, but wanted instead to do something with the idea of Scheherazade and ended up writing a 3-song cycle. And L'Indifférent is a particularly fascinating number because of its connection with its writer, its poetic writer. It's a song about a young man with soft eyes, languid hips, and no interest whatsoever in the young woman who is trying to seduce him. In other words, it's a song describing a beautiful gay man, which is what the song's poet, Tristan Klingsor, was. He was also not called Tristan Klingsor, which is a name derived from 2 Wagner characters. He was actually called Léon Leclerc. And he and Ravel were both members of an avant-garde group called Les Apaches, whose secret theme song, they really did have a secret theme song, was the opening of Borodin's Second Symphony. Now, this might seem very peculiar. Well, I suppose it is very peculiar, but the point really is that it's Russian music, and music from a kind of broadly conceived Orientalist zone of Asia that becomes very, very important and influential for composers like Ravel. And we hear that undeniably in the way that he's written the accompaniment for these Scheherazade songs, which he also orchestrates. They're irresistible, they sparkle and they seduce without shame, which is exactly what Orientalism was so famously supposed to do. And France in particular was caught up in Orientalist operatic topics, poetic topics, right back from the 1830s when Victor Hugo writes a collection called Les Orientales and defines the Orient as a geographical area that is in no way just east. It also includes Spain and Africa, as well as the areas of the world that you might think geographically from France you might include as being eastern. Don't forget that when Ravel writes these songs in 1903, it's less than 30 years since Bizet's Carmen has left audiences and critics clutching their pearls for this shameless woman who is both Spanish and a Romany. And in 1875, when Bizet's Carmen is first premiered, there's a remarkable review published that talks about the pathological condition of this unfortunate woman, meaning Carmen. Consecrated unceasingly and pitilessly to the fires of the flesh, it's fortunately a rare case, more likely to inspire the solicitude of physicians than to interest the decent spectators who come to the Opéra Comique accompanied by their wives and daughters. That is 6 years before Le Chat Noir opens. So really, the kind of generational culture clashes that are going on here are quite extraordinary to consider. If you're a fan of the music of Manuel de Falla, whose Polo we hear tonight, or if you admire Turina or Albéniz or Granados, you will find a whiff of what we might call Orientalism clinging to those composers even now, because there's, in this country and indeed in Western Europe more generally, there's a sort of double distance game going on with songs like Polo. Firstly, because we still associate Spanish music with sultry summer days and sexual freedom. You only have to watch adverts for EasyJet to see how this trope sticks around. Or car adverts. Seat is a classic if you want to. But also because Falla himself had to learn about the folk music of his own country. He was not a musician, nor was Albéniz or Granados. These were not musicians who grew up with the folk traditions of their country as something that they learned themselves as children. They were encountering it as kind of musicologists, effectively, and then learning how to work it into their own music. And in the same vein, Javier Monsalvatca tells us all about Cuba in one of the songs that we're going to hear, his Canciones Negras, that we hear a song from this evening. But he was living in Barcelona when he wrote this song. It just happened to be that there were a great many Catalonian emigrants who'd been in Cuba and because of the political crises in Cuba had come back to Barcelona, that he was able to talk to them and find out about what Cuba might be like and imagine. Just as Bizet was imagining Spain in the 1870s, just as Falla and Albéniz were imagining small market town dances all over the country where they'd not necessarily been when they were making their folk song arrangements and writing their piano pieces. And all of that leaves us with just 3 numbers on the programme that I've not yet mentioned. From Irving Berlin and Johannes Brahms, we hear songs of competition. One which we suspect might end well because it's between lovers. That's from Annie Get Your Gun. The other of which can only end badly because it's about 2 people who want the same lover. That's Die Schwestern by Brahms. And then the final song that I haven't yet mentioned is by Margaret Bonds, the superbly talented pianist, composer, and arranger who was the first black woman to perform with the all-male, all-white Chicago Symphony Orchestra and was a major success as a composer of theatrical works and also film scores. She was a very close friend of the poet Langston Hughes and wrote a great many songs to Langston Hughes' texts, including, among others, the song we hear tonight, I Too, which features in the Pride section of tonight's programme. But unlike the other songs in the Pride section of tonight's programme, this is a pride that is held up in the face of bitter and belittling prejudice. This is a pride that we can get behind in a way that doesn't feel sinful at all. So, across the board this evening, I can promise you a kaleidoscope of musical idioms, a fair amount of bad or at the very least suspect behaviour, plenty of drinking, quite a bit of dancing, not a little bit of silliness, but also a profound commitment from all the composers to the unorthodox, the exciting, new horizons, music that pulls no punches. And if you leave at the end of tonight's concert feeling just a little more sinful than you did when you came in, I think we can safely say that the performers will have done their jobs admirably. Thank you very much.